response and like solidarity. Oh, it says live now.
Okay, we are, yeah, so that was a sudden success. So, okay. Which means welcome to those of you who are watching. I'm not sure how many viewers we'll have. We'll have to see. As I said, I think we'll give people just a couple of minutes that we can give people a chance to log on, as we're on a non-standard time. But then it is the nature of the ENSO seminars that they will vary across time zones as they vary with geography. We had a sort of those first 5 or 6 seminars. I think we hopped continent with every one. So, so we will we'll get started soon. So I'm delighted to, and I'm sort of quite excited actually, to welcome our speaker Elena Cuffari, who will be presenting her work on an enactive approach to language. Elena completed her PhD at the University of Oregon with Mark Johnson, and has done work on hand gestures and the role of hand gestures in communication and cognition, and that work brought her to the University of the Basque Country in San Sebastian, where you completed a sort of substantial postdoctoral research with Hanne Jaegher and Ezequiel Paolo, which gave us that lovely 2015 paper on an enactive approach to language, which I think is, and as noted in the paper, is sort of it's such a substantial portion of what traditional cognitive science considers cognition to be, linguistic activity, and the quintessentially human and most abstract and most complex forms of cognition. To have it addressed directly and comprehensively by an enactive approach is essential to the approach really being taken seriously, I think. So it's for that reason alone, regardless of the quality of the work, which I think is excellent, it's really going to be a landmark paper, and I'm very much looking forward to its more expansive treatment in your the product of your current project. So I will. I guess we'll give people maybe 1 more minute and then we'll kick off if you're happy enough with that. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to you and Matthew for the series, and for being so patient with me about scheduling, and then for you, Mark, for being so patient with all the various technological tiny but persistent issues we had this week getting to this point. So,
no
thank
problem
you.
at all. It is. It's well, when Matthew started talking about the ENSO seminars and we were sort of getting them started, it was precisely their flexibility. You know, really taking advantage of the kinds of flexibility the internet offers was so that kind of thing, I think, is just central to the whole enterprise. It's certainly no onerous task or chore for us. So great. Okay, well, look, I think so. As the typical thing is, some people might sort of drop in or drop out. For those of you who might be viewing the stream live or maybe slightly delayed, in the chat section or the comment section of the stream, to the right hand side of the stream, is a link which will allow you to join the conversation directly. Now, if you decide to join the seminar, which would be great, you'll be sort of muted as you come in, but it will give us the opportunity to have a full conversation, be properly linguistic and participatory once the Q&A session comes around. So, but in the meantime, Elena, I will invite you to tell us about linguistic bodies, what they are, what they're not, and what they might be.
Okay, so I need to get my screen up just really quickly here, and okay. So this is very much a work in progress, but I wanted to take advantage of the chance I have with the seminar to have an audience of enactivist thinkers or fans and jump in the middle and talk about a central idea in a book that Ezequiel, Paolo, Hanne, Jaegher, and I are all working on together. This is the idea of linguistic bodies. These are our bodies, bodies that are conceived and carried and birthed and raised and dwell in human environments. These are bodies for whom sense-making is primordially participatory. And these are bodies for whom terms like precarious, adaptive, and autonomous hold true at existential as well as biological levels. And related to all this, these are bodies that sense and act in ways specifically catered to and capable of linguistic meaning. And we mean that in both expected and unexpected ways. So as Marek said in the introduction, this book comes out of a previous article where we try to see if from enactive principles of sense-making and participatory sense-making, we could say something about language that did not presuppose, or that presupposed as little as possible, received understandings of what linguistic phenomena are. We argued that human interactive sense-making can be explored on the basis of the enactive theory of sense-making, and that human interactive sense-making contains within itself stages of contradiction or struggle that are surpassed through dialectical negotiation, negotiations with environments, others, one's own various needs and feelings. We also argue that for any given human, one might find it's impossible to divorce languaging behavior from her overall whole body, moment to moment and month to month manner of living. All experience, even if it seems non-linguistic, we argue, has a special openness to language, such that human beings maintain a constant connection to language, which we relate to as a totality. But in the book, we're trying to get more detailed and exact about this. And this is just, this is in progress, but it's just to show that what I'm talking about today really is in the middle, won't be fully justified. I'll touch on some of the other chapters a little bit. And I'll start with something that we say in the first chapter and then have to go on and really explain and defend, and that goes a little bit beyond the scope of today, but I wanted to include it, which is, of course, what do we mean by linguistic, and the phrase linguistic sense-making or linguistic bodies. And what we mean is a set of phenomena that simultaneously manifest the following traits. One trait is dialectical structure at the level of action and at the level of interaction. So meaning results from the interplay of, for action, spontaneity and sedimentation. In interaction, we find a productive tension between the need interlocutors have to coordinate with each other and also the need they have to explore to find what is locally required to make sense together. So along with dialectical structure comes the ongoing, never settled negotiation of these dialectical tensions. And this negotiation is enacted in participatory sense-making moments. We can think of scaffolding, audience design, ecological affordances, co-authored, post hoc attributed intentionalities, and then, of course, participatory sense-making entails enactions of agency, which we define as asymmetrical regulation of self, environment, other, or the interaction dynamic itself. And that regulation takes place in terms of values, care, one's non-neutral or idiosyncratically positioned and embedded perspective. And I know this is quite a lot. There are two things to notice here, or I don't know, one thing to notice is that it's quite a lot. And I, like I said, can't fully explain all of it in this talk. But I do want folks to notice that we don't say words or sentences or even articulatory gestures in this definition. We take those as salient and important manifestations of the linguistic, but not, we don't want to hinge the account on them. And so just to try to give an example to make this a little bit more concrete of the way that all of these different features are in play, I have this picture from, I don't know if you're familiar, but it was a popular internet video meme a couple years ago, the Listen Linda meme. So you have this toddler talking to his mom, and he's saying, "Listen, Linda, 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 listen, honey, listen, honey." And he's sounding like an adult, maybe his dad, in an argument with his mom, very impassioned argument. I think it's about a cupcake and maybe about being spanked. A lot of his language is not clear. What's very clear are his usage of these adult arguing phrases, and his mom is filming it and is talking to him and is trying to figure out what the issue is and explain some rules and all of this thing. And so you see an asymmetrically guided interaction between the mother and child, where they are negotiating something and they're using settled forms, but there's also a lot of exploration happening in the moment in the video. in the coordination, and of course there's values at play that help them steer through and come to a sense and an understanding in the scene. So Jerome Bruner has a great quote that I tie in with this a little bit, which is that he says that a joint referent can come up in asymmetric conversations, and for one party this referent may initially be indistinct, but can be developed both for its truth value and its definiteness. And he's thinking about mother-child languaging interactions. And this works two ways, the indefiniteness of the referent. So a child may not be totally clear on what a word means, but a parent may also not be entirely clear on what a child's trying to say or sign. And Bruner says mothers early indicating and reference teaching is precisely of this order. They do not know what their children have in mind when they vocalize or gesture, nor are they sure their own speech has been understood by their children, but they are prepared to negotiate in the tacit belief that something comprehensible can be established. So together, there's this special kind of sense-making that humans are capable of doing and becoming better at doing. Involves each of these features that I have listed here, and the way that the parent treats the child as if they're capable of making sense is absolutely key to what happens in that interaction. And I want to talk also a little bit about what we mean by bodies in the phrase linguistic bodies. So bodies for enactivism are living, laboring, suffering bodies subject to disease, pains and pleasures, and that must attend to constitutive needs for food, shelter, sex, and relating to others. So these are needful bodies that are together and attuned together. In the book, we outlined 3 interrelated dimensions of embodiment that each and jointly showcase sense-making, and then each and jointly are transformed in the case of linguistic bodies. So living bodies, we think here of the enactive mantra, mind and life. These are minded, autonomous, self-individuating bodies. Living organisms actively and continuously produce a distinction between themselves and their environment where none existed before they appeared and where none will remain after they die. According to the enactive view, the relation between self-individuating bodies and their world are the very substance of the mental. Animate also, so while they move and act, our bodies are more concrete than machines. They don't function. They exist and relate, crave and reject, signify and trip over things. They're deeply rooted in materiality. And our bodies, our animate bodies, develop in deeply contingent ways, such that to be embodied is always already to be different from other bodies, and that will become more salient as I go on, as will the intersubjective dimension of embodiment. So our bodies are interdependent and intelligent in just this social we're learning and learning with, from, and because of others. Self and signification emerges out of interactions, and that's a fundamental aspect of the view that I will develop further. So being a sense maker implies an ongoing, often imperfect and variable attunement to the world and a readiness for action, and that is coming from our bodies. This holds true for linguistic bodies languaging in enlanguaged environments. A body that comes to be and has its being in language in an enlanguaged environment with languaging others has each of these dimensions and aspects of embodiment transformed. So a little bit about each of the terms separately, and I'll move into the 3 sort of title moves of the talk. Linguistic bodies are. So in saying that we are linguistic bodies, we are making an ontological claim on the same register as, for example, Heidegger's claim that Dasein is the being for whom its own being is an issue, or Judith Butler's claim that linguistic bodies are those who are constituted in language by the address of another. It's an answer to the question, what kind of beings are we? But the answer we give is informed by empirical research and experiential reflection, even if it goes to an ontological level. Engaged with and in the totality of language is a dialectical endeavor, one for which we are prepared by the original experiences of primary intersubjectivity. So we want to claim that babies are linguistic bodies, for example. Among other research, we draw on the work of Joanna Rosazek-Leonardi and her colleagues Iris Nomiko and Katrina Rolfing, who cast doubt on the possibility that there is such a thing as a pre-linguistic infant. Because language packages events for our perception, it's hard to argue that babies live and make sense not somehow in language. They perceive in social linguistically carved environments. A very cool recent study by Smith, show that sustained attention and perception in 1-year-olds are educated by parents, parents' gaze, parents' interactions with objects, and sustained attention and perception are part of knowing one's way around the world generally, and our claim is that knowing one's way around the human world is a linguistic knowing in the sense that we mean by linguistic. So there was a great diapering study in 2011 by these scholars that showed interactional routines between mothers who do these sort of multimodal voice, posture, gaze, engagements with their babies while they're diapering them. And then in 2014, a follow-up study traced the relationship between the infant attention to this mother's performance at 3 months and at 6 months, and the relation to language development at 24 months, and found pretty significant correlations that there'd be more productive vocabulary and more spoken verbs for 24-month-olds who at 3 and 6 months had their mothers appropriately to their own attention package multimodal information for them, basically. And there's a lot of role switching here, and it generally comes together to support Jerome Bruner's previous notion of a language acquisition support system, that again, the human babies are doing language, they're learning language because their parents treat them as if they are linguistic bodies, and in a sense we're saying that they indeed are. Paired with the enactive emphasis on certain non-canonical features of languaging, that list I showed earlier, these points build strong support for the idea that babies, infants, children are linguistic bodies, even if as young and tiny humans they are still in processes of becoming what they are. And actually that idea of becoming what one is something that we take as very important throughout life to our idea of language. So growing up in the environments and milieus that we do, we develop sensitivities to certain acts and strategies of coping, and we incorporate the coping practices until they become constitutive of our ways of being in the world. What we most notably incorporate into our bodies as human beings is a linguistic manner of living, being, doing, and sense-making. So this is really the key idea, both in the first paper and in the book, which is that we're trying to show that living in an environment leads to structural changes in the body and sense-making, and then also to say a little bit about how this happens. The process of incorporating linguistic sensitivities and powers is idiosyncratic. It's part of the process of autonomous individuation. Each sense maker has his own ontogeny of rolling into language. And this idea that I have of rolling into language is a little bit of an update of Maturana, saying that a brain becomes a languaging brain when it couples to the linear flow of language. For us, our living, animate, intersubjective bodies are always becoming linguistic bodies. It's not a settled process, it's an ongoing incorporation process. When it comes to young children, you can consider how the contingencies of one's upbringing lead to real differences in style, personality, potential moral compass, and language. There is some research that shows that when mothers can't synchronize so well with their new children due to postpartum depression, that does have an impact on some of the measures that are taken like at 24 months when it comes to language development. So linguistic bodies are sensitive and powerful. They're marked by bearing traces of a habituated history of acquired sensitivities to the enactions of others that manifest these features of the linguistic, the abilities to coordinate, regulate, and navigate dialectical tensions. Linguistic bodies are also lifelong learners. On our terms, incorporating specific sensitivities and acquiring powers related to languaging is a lifelong process. You can think of learning a foreign language, learning the language of your field of technical expertise, of your particular institutional culture, how to talk at department meetings, what people are talking about at department meetings when you join a new department, learning the language of your in-laws, someone you don't really understand well, learning Pilates, keeping up with the times. And in all of these cases, new vocabulary, but also new ways of bodily being and experiencing are brought about. Merleau-Ponty writes in his studies on child psychology that all acquisition made at a certain level must be begun again at a higher level. So think of knowing what furnace or insulation means your whole life and then becoming a homeowner and finding out in a more vivid or directly consequential way what those words mean or how much they cost. Continuing the passage from Merleau-Ponty, quote, regarding infantile egocentrism, it will have been surpassed long ago on the level of perception when the child must surpass it on the intellectual logical plane. Even for the adult, expression of what is most his own in his experience will always have to be perfected. Hence, far from being limited to the first years, language acquisition is coextensive with the very exercise of language. And that was from from Merleau-Ponty. So we want to say that from the very beginning, from before birth up until our current sense-making and beyond, we are incorporating the ability to make sense locally and more globally in enlanguaged environments. All of this ongoing incorporation is motivated by and takes place in living with others and in caring about them. And so linguistic bodies then make sense together at any given moment in things like spontaneous conversational hand gestures, facial expressions, gazes, or matching leg crosses. And an upshot of the incorporation view is that such gestures or behaviors don't show mind, they are mind. Cognition is sense-making involving and spanning levels of processes of the body and of linguistic bodies. This accords with the general enactive life-mind logic, and we're extending this to apply to the lives of linguistic bodies. So you have been looking at this picture perhaps for a little while now and interpreting it and making sense with it as we are wont to do. And I just wanted to pause to say, this isn't a picture of any linguistic bodies. This is me and my aunt, and I'm pregnant with my son in the picture, so he's present, if unborn, witnessing and surely contributing in certain ways to the sense-making of the scene. And I am speaking with one of my favorite people in the world who died about a year after it was taken. It wasn't the last time I saw her, but the last time I saw her at her home in Oregon. So the picture means something to you in a general way. Now it means something to you a little bit differently. It still doesn't mean exactly to you what it'll mean to me. But what I do draw out of it in part is that we have in the picture the bookends of sense-making, right? We have birth and death. Neither directly visible, both exist in the picture as potentialities that we did happen to be aware of in the conversation without knowing when and how they would come to pass. The photo acts as a reminder for me of the precariousness, materiality, and depth of our sense-making. There's no returning to that moment, although there is some returning partially, and my here and now sense-making in some ways is always referring to it. I can't fully recover the sense we were in the midst of making when the photo was taken, but I had then and I have now my own unique perspectives on it, although those are shifting. And those come from who I was, who I am, who she was. And for example, I hated the picture when my husband took it and posted it, but now it's very special to me. So we make sense in time. We're making sense together, but we also make sense in time, always from a present and idiosyncratic point. But it's a time that's very rich because of the creatures that we are. Okay, so gets to a little bit easier stuff now. Linguistic bodies are not the same. This is an argument mainly to be had with cognitive linguistics, but I think a nice point was made on this by Javier Gonzalez de Prado Salas in a recent paper in the Language Sciences on metaphor, that in common image schematic type embodiment is a level of constraint on our languaging, but it's just one level, and we can't stop there. If we stop with the standard body referenced in cognitive linguistics, the body that orients itself forward and vertically, or that seeks warmth and prefers to keep balanced, we remain isolated in an abstract universality that cannot explain difference and that is too readily undermined by counterexamples. Broad commonalities neither guarantee shared meaning nor give us enough to select between competing meaning possibilities. So that's one way that we want to differentiate ourselves. And also, linguistic bodies are not textual phantasms. Here we're trying to differentiate ourselves from an ephemeral post-structuralist treatment of the body as fully discursively produced. For example, regarding hate speech, Butler premises human subjectivity upon language, and oftener than not in a language comes first, rather than in a reciprocal or circular way. Our dialectical approach begins with the struggle between individuality and intersubjectivity and sees languaging as emergent from these negotiations. At any given here and now moment, a languaging adult human relates to the totality of language in order to make sense and perhaps to live, but is not exhausted by or lost in that totality. If you read the words pinch yourself, you may or may not pinch yourself, and in some ways the experience is linguistically afforded, but you cannot have the experience of being pinched in language alone, which is maybe a trivial point, but that's what came to mind. At the same time, however, we would not be the bodies we are if we did not have a history of and capacities of regular engagement with texts. So we are not suggesting that linguistic bodies are prior to language, nor are they after language. And I can talk more about that in the question and answer. And so then What might linguistic bodies be? Well, keeping in mind some lessons of post-structuralist feminist thought and other traditions is useful when it comes to grappling with the ethical ramifications of our view of what it means to be a linguistic body. To live in language is to live in systems of power and oppression. And activists can, I think, at least recognize that the question of how linguistic sense-making interplays with experience, while being very interesting metaphysically and epistemologically, and while helping us advance various aspects of theory, can never be neutral. It's not a neutral question in a person's life. So we plan to address this in later chapters of the book. I'll just close with some suggestions. Increasingly, in the literature, we find compelling models and analyses of linguistic interactions that identify patterns of entrainment, synchrony, alignment, synergy, coordination, and so on. And as I've argued in a few places, I think this is cool, and it shifts away from intracranial representation-based descriptions or guesses about what goes on during a conversation. But at the same time, I think it calls for some care and reflection. Linguistic bodies appear to be very good at getting swept up in conversation. I think that this project, I think participatory sense-making generally explain why that might be the case, but I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. In fact, participatory sense-making may predict that noticing what's happening for oneself during an interaction is often difficult. Mindfulness is a possibility for linguistic bodies thanks to the ability to direct one's linguistic sense-making inward. And it's a possibility we should cultivate, in my view, because ideally it would allow openness to an interaction while tracking or just keeping some connection to one's own evolving experience. So part of the idea here is that if language is so deeply embodied and wrapped up in who we are and who we're always coming to be, as I'm saying, then doing language with someone else is never a neutral thing, and is doing something to them and with them all the time, and also to ourselves. So I think it's important that we take some care with this. Mindfulness is needed, I think, not just in terms of the use of one's, it's not only just needed in terms of sensitivity, of seeing how I'm doing, but also in terms of our own linguistic power. On this point, we can think back to the question of how parents structure their experiences of their children, but there are many different asymmetrical interactions of which we are routinely part, teachers and students and others. So cultivation is, I think, necessary. Effort, in other words, is necessary because I don't think this comes easily, and some recent empirical evidence confirms this worry. Galantucci and colleagues Bruno Galantucci in New York and colleagues have noticed that people's telephone conversations can be crossed without them becoming aware. And this is just one example of how accustomed we are to languaging on autopilot. So I think that given these findings, and the power of dynamic systems approaches to linguistic coordination, or the phenomena of interaction autonomy presented in participatory sense-making, may suggest that to do this sort of effort, we think about intention setting outside of certain interactions, or the way that we're involved in multiple interactions, or the way that we move through time, out of one into another, and perhaps plan for the next, and that kind of thing. So that is what I have for today. And is everybody still with me?
Yes, sorry, I had I spoke there without unmuting myself. I was trying to unmute both Hanne and Ezequiel, but failed to take care of my own camera first.
Hi.
Okay. But thank you very much. That was excellent.
Thanks. Sorry, I was maybe a little fast there.
No, that was bang on. Sorry, Ezequiel, I don't seem to be able to unmute you at this point. Maybe, okay, there we go. I think we've managed that now. But yes, excellent, and we have to clap high in order to be caught on camera to do so.
Thank you.
So given the audience we've got, I figure I should probably start with some questions, right? So
yeah, it's sort of like
there are viewers. I think there are maybe one or two people who are having a look at the stream but have not joined us. And if you are watching the stream but haven't joined, you can ask questions. If you raise questions in the chat box to the right of the view, I will present them to Elena, and indeed we'll be able to present them for discussion to Elena and Hanne and Ezequiel as well. So I actually have quite a number of questions. Some of them fairly sort of narrowly focused, some of them more extensive, I suppose. I'll start with something, with just an invitation maybe to say a little bit more about the concept of incorporation. And what I noticed in the way you presented the notion of incorporation, you seem to, I don't know whether you did it deliberately or just out of habit, specifically avoid the phrase skill learning, which is how I suppose the kind of language that would very commonly used in much of the enactive literature, and in particular the dynamic sensory motor literature that's related. I'm just wondering if there is a sort of a theoretical reason for that, or if it's just an issue about phrasing and wording.
Thanks. So I'll do my best to resist the temptation to defer to Ezequiel and Hanne on all of these questions since they're here. But I think in some sense it's a personal habit. I'm not terribly wrapped up in the skill learning side of things, but also I think that the idea is that it's not just that I become able to do something, but that I'm fundamentally transformed through the incorporation of linguistic sensitivities and powers. Sorry, I don't know if you can all see what pops up on my computer there. So incorporation also, as I was saying, is important in a sort of twofold way. I think it's sort of presupposed in the logic of our dialectical expansion model, which I won't necessarily go into, but the idea that navigating through stages of coordination and sense making opens up into new moments of other problems that will have contradictions, tensions, and needs for more sense making. So the idea is that, you know, you solve one problem, you reach another stage, and you've kind of incorporated the solutions, the coping strategies, the meaning of the first situation, and that gives you a new world. It's almost a kind of Marxist second nature, reworking of the environment. You find yourself in a new set of problems with new abilities to also respond to them. And then we have, you know, the developmental, more ontogenetic perspective also that's trying to show that in interacting with parents, children are learning how to make sense. They're so there may be skills. There are like verbs, for example, or, you know, greetings, handshakes. If you think of those as skills, then there is an incorporation of skill. But I think that we're trying to take a more, you know, existential, spanning the levels kind of picture on this, where it's not so discrete. It's not just like, oh, now I'm able to do this one thing. Actually, my whole like orientation to reality, myself to other people, may be shifted as I go forward. But I think in certain local situations, like, it would be possible to think about this in terms of skill. Does that start to address?
Cool. Yeah, no, I think so. It does. It's really an emphasis, sort of pushing the emphasis out. I suppose skill does come with so much theoretical baggage and sort of prior assumptions, particularly in the literature we're already working in. That,
yeah, we try to use, I guess, in some ways, sensitivities and powers is what is getting incorporated, right? So, like, is it a skill to be able to hear and resonate with certain things, to attune to certain things in other people, and then is it a skill to be able to respond? I mean, I think, yeah, it's not my framework. I'm sure there's overlap. I know we have a section where we say that there's a reason we're not talking about it in terms of skills, and I'm kind of blanking on it at the moment. Those are my reasons.
Cool. Hanne, Ezequiel, do you want to say a couple of words on that, or? Nope.
Well, no, I mean, it's, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, I just kind of agree with this idea that you choose the right word, not because it's in opposition to another word, but you want to give the right connotations with that word. And while the word skill could be interpreted also as for instance, acquiring a skill that allows you to be more sensitive to certain events, or I mean, we usually tend to think of skills as things you can do, you know, like skill at typewriting and things like that. But I mean, I think incorporation might be better at conveying this idea that essentially your whole world is changed by this incorporation, because you're now sensitive to other things apart from being able to do other things. But perhaps yeah. somebody could say that they interpret skills in that same sense,
Right.
and that's fine too.
I mean, the example that we use with incorporation in the paper, and maybe also in the book, is of smoking. Actually, being addicted to smoking, which is not a happy incorporation, but it's also not a skill. It's your body, as we've said, kind of gives over some of its processes and sustainability and needs to a behavior, an internal behavior of smoking a cigarette. And it's, even though compromising the body, it satisfies a local set of needs that you've adopted and taken into yourself. And so, if that's our logic of incorporation, it's a sort of bigger than skill, maybe.
Yeah. No, it's a nice point. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so I guess maybe a slightly bigger question then is just I'm going to possibly a little bit meanly pick up on a particular phrase that you used, and I guess look to you unpack it. I'm trying to find out if there is if there's an implication, or whether it was just a particular phrase that happened to work in the context or sentence you were uttering at the time, as it were. But you spoke about adult linguists, or a languaging adult relating to the entirety of language during the process of speaking and of languaging. And I have, so there's
totality, right?
The totality of language, sorry,
Yeah.
okay. So that the notion of language that you're looking for is sort of explicitly enacted and dynamic, and yet the totality of language hints at a noun, right? And what I'm curious about is, so obviously it'll be a dynamic noun, and it's it might be a Heraclitean river that we never step into the same language twice, or we never speak with the same language twice. But I'm curious as to what you specifically mean by the phrase, and to unpack it a little bit.
Okay, thanks. I don't think there's anything mean about that, and I think it's helpful. So thank you. Languaging. So in terms of like that dialectic, right, the play of spontaneity and sedimentation, so we're saying that to be a linguistic body is to be accustomed to negotiating that, right, and to navigating that, and to working with that interplay to make meaning. Or Eugene Denlin talks about the relation between felt sense and symbol as the necessary interplay for meaning, which I think is in some ways similar to Merleau-Ponty's idea of sedimentation, spontaneity. That suggests there's some parts, at least, that are bigger than us, right? And so we talk about the generation of norms, actually, the way I like to talk about it, I don't know if it's useful, is horizons of reference and norms. So things that we build up together that then are there. They're there because other people experience them and know about them. They're there because of writings, institutions, the way that we change the world through our sense-making activity that then persists and is around, after us, before us, outside of us. That's the kind of totality that we have in mind. And I think it's tricky. It's really tricky for us because we're trying to not say, like Judith Butler, or at least a certain kind of reading of that tradition that says, it's just discursive, it's just linguistic, you can't step out of it. It's just norms, there's nothing outside of this. We have bodies, we're very committed to the materialism in that sense. And we have ineffability also, and we're also committed to that in experience. But at the same time, I think that the idea is something like we're linguistic bodies. Even if we do non-linguistic things, we're still linguistic bodies. We're still always open to the ability to tune in or switch in or like engage in that way instead of another. And all of that tuning and engaging means that, okay, now I'm going to write something or gesture or follow codified instructions. It gets very tricky when it comes to finding examples that don't use words, and we're all still working on that, I think. But so yeah, there's a totality because it's bigger than me. It's bigger than any one instance of sense making that I might do with you. Like, we're speaking English, there's something bigger than us there. But I don't want to say that language is just the set of the world's languages. So I understand the tension and what's motivating the question, I think, but that's what I was trying to point at with totality.
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I suppose it really it comes back to that first slide that you had, where you identify the sort of the key issues about language, and that word, you know, as you said, words and sentences aren't there, but everything else we do is. And
Yeah.
I guess it resonates with me because and this, I'm just going to become one of those annoying people in the seminar who uses a question to try and make his own point, but which is probably terribly rude, particularly when I'm chair, but
Abuse your power.
yeah, that's it. So, well, because as we spoke just briefly before the talk, and I mentioned that I was drawing a lot on ecological psychology in my own work in recent time, and ecological psychology faces precisely the same kinds of criticisms that enactivism has, which is that it's a perceptual motor thing, or it's what we call lower cognition, or basic cognition, and the whole thing hasn't dealt very well with the whole approach hasn't dealt very well with what would standardly be called higher cognition, and in particularly language. But there is a concept within ecological thinking that I have found useful, which is the notion of a medium. Now, in ecological psychology, the medium is very much the physical stuff, right? We just about everything human beings do is done in the medium of air, and occasionally water, and in very few spaces, or a few examples, space, but they don't last very long. But the medium in which we exist constrains the kinds of things that we can perceive and the kinds of actions that we can perform. Now, for the ecological psychologist, it is essential that the medium be a physical medium in which energy arrays can form and be stable.
Okay.
But there is a strong sense in which that kind of the ecological logic that allows perception to occur because of structure in arrays of energy is, I think, very analogous to the language as a medium, but in precisely the same way that you talk about it, that it's a medium of normative, habitual, routine behaviors, and utterances, and means of coordination. But you can only do anything with that medium by messing with it, right? So the whole point is you don't just do the normal thing, and you don't just do the if it were static, and if it were robotic, and if it were absolute in any way, it would be useless, because it would be a medium that couldn't transfer any structure, right? It would be like opaque air. So it's and I guess what I was trying to gauge really is whether that notion of a medium is something that would fit or be consistent with the way you're thinking about language, or whether the way in which the role that language is playing is something else, something more specific than that.
I like it a lot. What's similar, but I think we also want to differentiate ourselves from is the sort of distributed languaging picture of first and second order, and like a clean distinction can be made where there's like the dictionaries, that's our second order, and like the language as a form, as a sort of closed system, and then the first order as our inhabiting of it. I think it's closer to this medium idea where, it reminds me of I can't like quote off the top of my head, but Dewey talking about breathing and how breathing involves air. Like it involves both the internal and the external working together, processing together. It's like an act that crosses over. And I think that linguistic sense making is kind of similar. I want to say it sounds, what you said, Mark, they sound compatible. The work of development language learning for me is very much all about being constrained by where you are and who your parents are and who your teachers are and what language is around and what phrases are around. And you see in adolescence with memes and what catches on. That matters to sense making and to self making, I think, and that's what's in your environment. You kind of interacting with that, and So I like the idea of a physical constraint and language as the same, and I don't know if we'd have to do it as an analogy, because if it's not air, like it seems like a metaphor, right, to say that it's air, but I think that there's something very real about that too.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess that is it's a theme that that's run a bit through kind of related enactive writings, and even just the more general notion of the sensory motor contingency is that notion that constraints are liberating. They, you know, the fulcrum allows to get work done, but you need the fixed point too, and to have those to think of language in those terms is a more effective means than this message passing notion that we really want to get past. Yeah, cool. So I have one other question, which is a more general one. I don't know if Hanne, but I don't want to. I want to give Hanne and Ezequiel an opportunity to jump in. You're both expert linguistic skilled linguists, so I'm sure you'd be well capable of using the various resources available to you to join in should you wish. But nevertheless,
okay.
I would be lax if the chair did not give you an opportunity.
I'm just still thinking about this question of the medium. I mean, in the original paper, we have a model and a figure where we talk a little square, and that figure has a label that says enlanguaged environments or something like this. But that was meant very, very broadly, actually, very broadly in the sense of living in a world that is surrounded by language, when all the creatures around you, as well as all kinds of objects, have all these marks of language and the behaviors of people and so on. So, but I'm still thinking about whether the question of the medium might be addressed or considered from different angles. I mean, it wouldn't be difficult to just say that, what I just said, and say, well, then language is a medium in which you're surrounded and so on. But that's okay. Be something else in that we might say something more specific, and the same medium in which we inhabit physically or organically might itself impinge in the way that language is structured, or language sounds even. And I was remembering this thing I was reading recently, this book by is it David Abram, The Spell of the Sensuous, where he has all kinds of interesting studies. He mentions of language and tribes that are in the jungle, and how the words resemble the calls of birds and things like that, and or how the environment actually makes the language sound differently. So I think that's an interesting thing to also consider. You know, the actual, very much like you need the air to do certain things and move in certain ways. It's the same air. I mean, there's the air of a forest or of the Arctic that also changes the way you do languaging, and that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Yeah. I guess there's some. There might be some interesting questions about air density at different altitudes and so on, and whether there might be differences in the likelihoods of certain phonemes existing in different languages on the basis of.
But also how language depending on the society that you're considering and the kind of way in which they survive, their lifestyle, language gets embedded into the physical geography too. I mean, you got the Australian, what is it, the songs, the song lines, the song lines that connect to features in the environment with stories or songs, and that there's this funny thing that if you drive in a car, they have to sing the song very quickly because they really cannot differentiate each part of the song from the mountain or whatever, the river that they're crossing or things like that. So again, language it's another of the many ways in which language is material. That's how I would put it. It's embedded in this materiality. It's not just this ideal world of words and sentences.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna. Yeah, the chair coughing when he's got a microphone directly in front of his mouth is a little bit more disruptive than in a normal seminar. So I have, if you'll, if you're willing to hang on just a couple more minutes, I have a final question, Elena, which sort of is aimed particularly at the ethical considerations that you raised, which I think are particularly interesting and involving. And that notion that basically once you take the dialectical nature of language and the dialogicality of language seriously, you can't interact with someone without that exchange of power,
Right.
which is, there's going to be maybe a sort of a shared sort of exchanged asymmetry or periods at least of asymmetry, and yet, so I guess in the talk you mainly just wanted to raise awareness of that, and you were sort of mainly focused on the importance of becoming aware of it and remaining sensitive to it. But I felt as you were talking that there's a complementary aspect to that dialogicality, which is and it's something I've thought about, and I haven't read enough about enactive approaches to ethics. I know Steve Torrance and Jaegher and Cuffari have written a bit on this. But what strikes me about an enactive ethic would be the importance of maintaining that dialogue. So while there's an ethical dimension to always within a dialogue between two people, and an active ethics would also suggest that that dialogue nevertheless be maintained, that to the point at which we begin to become unethical is the point at which we lose our sensitivity to the other, and disengage or attempt to act without them affecting us in some way. And I guess the issue of in-group and out-group and the objectification in others and so on kind of plays a substantial role in that, or parallels it in a lot of ways. And I guess I'm wondering, is that complementarity, does it play a big role in the way you think about the issue of mindfulness and that issue of speaking with someone and doing things to them and with them in dialogue?
I'm not sure I totally understand the suggestion. So when you say importance of maintaining the dialogue, what do you mean? Do you mean like that even if things aren't going well, it's best to continue, or that there's an interaction, that if things aren't going well, then there must be a breakdown, so we're not even actually interacting, or I wasn't quite sure where the
yeah, so I probably don't have a very clear notion of that myself. I guess my sense of it would be that in a kind of more individualistic, maybe traditional view of the psychological subject, you have the best thing to do with power is almost to let people be, to not have power over someone, or trying to reduce or eliminate. Whereas when we're inactive, we don't have that option. If we attempt to separate ourselves from that other person, we make ourselves insensitive to them, and bad things follow. So in order to be ethical, we must be sensitive to the other, but in order to be sensitive to them, we must interact with them and therefore get involved in this power issue. So on the one hand, we have this concern to limit negative influence, but on the other hand, in order to have any kind of positive influence, we must have influence. And to try and step away from that is, in fact, this
is maybe too easy of an answer, but it's one thing I've talked about and thought about a little bit.
It's certainly a very good first step. I find it very appealing, actually, just that to reintroduce the ethic and the morality involved in the concept of mindfulness that has very much been stripped out of it as it became more of a tool for controlling upset people, really. In a lot of ways, it's. I mean, coming from a psychology background, you can't turn left without bumping into mindfulness
Right.
of
Right.
some
Well, because it's a
form
great,
now, then
it's a great real therapy when it's used in
Mm.
that way. Right. But
so yeah, I mean, it is, and it's becoming, it's becoming very popular in schools at both primary and secondary level, and to a large extent, it's actually, it's very much a positive thing. But within the education system, it's almost it's frequently deployed as a means of calming your kids down.
yeah.
It really is the sense of, and often with the best of intentions. The point, the teacher wants to be able to calm the kids and cope with them so that they can improve their education, but there is a question at which, I guess it really is, it comes back to your point that the teacher is not just doing something with the students. They're doing something to the students in that whole process too. And
Right. I mean, that sounds like behavior
mindfulness goes
modification
both ways.
To an extent. Whereas I actually have a paper coming out a little bit about a kind of way to try to make it to develop the ethical and aesthetic side of this that has to do with the art of gesture receiving, which is again trying to focus on what I'm doing in a conversation, the doing that I'm doing when I'm not doing, to say it in the most needlessly difficult way possible. What's happening when I'm listening and receiving things. So the teacher in that case, to be judgmental for a second, is not hearing something in the children. She or he is worried about, this isn't the result that I want, right? And how am I going to get the result that I want? As opposed to like, oh, I feel super uncomfortable and stressed because of the way this child's carrying on. Like, that's the moment to go in and figure out, what's happening there. What am I supposed to be hearing that I'm not hearing? So it's very hard to kind of think about what my own consciousness is doing in this completely co-constituted moment. But that's the trick, both ethically and epistemologically, that I really want to work on. But there's a lot to develop.
Yeah, no, it's a really important and excellent question. I think it's very good. I should probably do a disclaimer, given that this is on the internet. I'm not blanketly criticizing all teachers for engaging in mindfulness practice. Far from it. I guess it's just being concerned that there's such a thing as bad practice in mindfulness too. So I guess we've had a sort of a good session. We're approaching a solid hour of work. Hanne, Ezequiel, would either of you like to make a final comment, or Elena, is there any last thing you'd like to add?
No, thanks for the really great questions, Mark. They're all really helpful, and thank you for being here with the questions. And to Ezequiel and Hanne for also joining, and anyone else watching.
That's it. So so thanks very much, Elena. I'm going to be thinking about that one for quite a while, actually. So that's very much enjoyed that. Our next ENSO seminar will be on the very 1st of December, so you won't see it coming. That's going to be tricky because normally we have our first Thursday in the month, and once the month comes around, you can have a think about when the ENSO seminar is going to be, but it'll happen before you get an opportunity to think that. So Erik Rietveld from the University of Amsterdam will be joining us, and I guess we can look forward to that for the coming month. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Elena.
Thank you.
Okay.